Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar. My name is Rachel Gregg, and I'm a lead scientist at EcoAdapt, as well as the content director for the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange, or CAKE. Today's webinar, Uncovering Risks and Opportunities in the Global Marketplace with the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Index, is sponsored by CAKE, which is a program of EcoAdapt. CAKE is an online resource dedicated to building the field of adaptation by providing key case studies, resources, tools, and more to help people figure out how to innovate and implement adaptation solutions in a changing climate. A lot of opportunity exists for the private sector to contribute to that innovation piece, as well as in implementing and investing in adaptation, not just by reducing risks internally, but also focusing on other vulnerable regions and sectors around the world. Our speakers today are Joyce Coffey and Dr. Jessica Hellman from ND-Gain. Joyce is the managing director of ND-Gain, and as such is the executive lead for the index and related adaptation research, outreach, and implementation. Jessica is ND-Gain's research director. She advises research staff and other experts so that ND-Gain and its related activities capture cutting-edge knowledge about the nature of climate change and strategies for reducing the impacts of climatic change. And with that, I would like to introduce Joyce Coffey.
Well, thank you so much, and it's a real pleasure to be with you all today. We're excited to share a little bit more with you about how we are uncovering global marketplace risks and opportunities through the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Index. ND-Gain is the world's leading index showing which countries are best prepared to deal with the global changes brought about by overcrowding, resource constraints, and climate disruption. And the index aims to unlock global adaptation solutions in the corporate and development community that save lives and improve livelihoods while strengthening market positions. It informs strategic, operational, and reputational decisions regarding supply chains, capital projects, and community engagements. And today we're going to speak with you a little bit further about the tool and also talk to you about why climate adaptation is such an important key contributor to corporate decision making. First, I'd like to just point out that many people and many leaders in many sectors are already talking about climate adaptation as part of their business as usual. Ecolab speaks about water stress and the incredibly important role that it plays in Ecolab's work. PepsiCo similarly talks about water availability and also agriculture as it relates to its supply chain. And of course the UN, which has been very forthright in its methods and principles around climate adaptation, has been trying to lead the world towards a more climate adaptive future. So there are three ways that the adaptation in the private sector is being played out. The first is that the private sector is looking to exploit new business opportunities, and this may seem a bit controversial, but the bottom line is that for the corporate sector to adequately engage in climate adaptation, they need to be able to see a return on their investment, and they need to be able to see a real market play for their work and their innovation. And we need their innovation in order to be able to prepare for our futures. Adaptation in the private sector also, of course, includes avoiding negative impact, and risk avoidance is at the heart of all corporate decision making. And finally, many private sector leaders see that they have an opportunity to contribute to more resilient communities, decreasing damage to social well-being, the economy, and the environment by helping communities to be more climate adaptive. Now, of course, when I speak about climate adaptation, I acknowledge that for most decision makers, and certainly most decision makers in the corporate sphere, climate change is never thought about in isolation. In fact, there are groups of forces that are really driving decision making, and all of them are global. Many of you have probably experienced these changes in your work life as well. Certainly climate change is one, but globalization and the incredible understanding of not only the global marketplace, but the global supply chain, urbanization, and the shift in populations towards the urban centers around the world. It's at 20% to 30% in some cities in Africa, for instance. Population growth, another really key question as it relates to global forces impacting all of us, but also to the corporate sphere. In addition to those forces, they are causing or contributing to everything from civil strife to water and food scarcity to extreme weather related impacts. And finally, I think it's interesting for those of us on the phone to understand a little bit more about what it means that we have a change in consumer expectations driven in part by the rise of the millennial generation, people born between the years of 1985 and 1991, who are expecting a lot more out of their world, especially because of their access to technology. And this is true of people all over the world, not just in the United States. So before we get too much further, it's probably good to get out there what our definition of adaptation is. And certainly this is not unique to us, but many people have nuances to their adaptation. So we'll speak to adaptation as being an adjustment in natural or human systems to a new or changing environment that exploits beneficial opportunities or moderates negative ones. I want to just speak a little bit to why I think the corporate sector is really primed to be a very active player in climate adaptation. The first is that in the UN, the Green Climate Fund, which came initially out of Kyoto and has been re-upped at every COP since, targets annual disbursements to emerging economies of up to $100 billion by 2020. And we'll see on the next slide that those disbursements can't possibly all come from governments or from the multinational development organizations. We also see a huge increase in the infrastructure industry, which is projected to grow $3.3 billion in the next 4 years. And of course, we've seen that growth escalate to this level in past years as well. In part, we see that because the global losses have also really grown from natural disasters. The $380 billion figure for 2011 does include the tragedies in Japan, which of course were not directly climate related, but still the number was very high. And finally, the corporate sector is really seeing physical risks from climate change throughout their supply chain. This comes from the Carbon Disclosure Project's survey of executives as it relates to their supply chains. And one really interesting thing from my perspective is that they've been asking this question for several years, and this was the first year that the executives identified the physical risks from climate change. Previously, it had been that the risk from climate change was the risk of regulation and the uncertainty of cap and trade versus carbon tax and whether it was going to be impacting their business not only in the United States but around the world. So now those physical risks have really taken the lead in their question. So as I mentioned earlier, there's this demand for $100 billion in disbursements every year starting in 2020 for those least developed economies coming from the Green Climate Fund. But where will that money come from? You can see that, in fact, the estimates are even over $100 billion in some cases, but that current adaptation funding is estimated at only about $3.5 billion per year from the OECD countries. And so there's an extremely significant gap. And in fact, the UN and the World Bank and others are expecting the corporate sector to fill in that gap. As I mentioned earlier, they'll only do so if they see business opportunities from that decision. So what does the corporate sector want in order to help them prioritize their business decisions? One is that they want to really better understand what their value chain risk and opportunity is as it relates to climate. They're eager to understand better where they can get tools, data, and indicators that help them to figure out what their new markets might be, where they might better put their products and services around the world. Also, to better understand how they can mitigate risk, and finally, how they can enhance their corporate social responsibility impacts through their climate adaptation platforms. I think I went one slide too far there, so just a moment, please. So corporate decision making is, of course, based not just on climate adaptation. And one thing that's really crucial to us at ND-Gain is that we're savvy about what other tools corporations are using as they consider their global value chain. So we've done benchmarks of many different types of tools, and here's just a few that we know are really important for corporate decision makers. Certainly the Consumer Confidence Index, the Consumer Demand Index, but also those indices that are specific to a particular question. For instance, the Human Development Index, the Ease of Doing Business Index, and the Corruption Perceptions Index. So all of these indices are used by corporations to make global decisions. They're often used at the investor level on quarterly calls when there's not enough time to get into the details, so an index really provides very quick information that helps with relative decision making. And we also have a whole set of tools around adaptation that we've looked at. I'm going to turn it over at this point to my colleague, Dr. Jessica Hellman, who will take you a little bit through these other index tools and also in more detail into the ND-Global Adaptation Index.
Great. Thank you, Joyce, and thanks so much for the opportunity to be here. My task is to drill down into this idea of indices and indicators. Joyce just shared some indicators that are important to the private sector. Let's shift gears into adaptation and sort of drill down and talk about data, and particularly with reference to data and information of value to the private sector. Joyce just alluded to some benchmarking that we have done of a variety of tools. This slide shows you some adaptation tools. There are a number of tools that have been developed, and many of these have value to corporations and to companies. These include things like the World Resources Institute's Aqueduct, the Climate Change Knowledge Exchange, of which we are all very familiar, Yale University's EPI, and our own, for example, at the University of Notre Dame, Collaboratory for Adaptation to Climate Change. A number of these provide data. Some of them provide indicators or indices. Some of them provide knowledge and resources, and some of them provide platforms for interaction to facilitate adaptation innovation. ND-Gain's sort of strategic position that it occupies as an adaptation resource is one that specifically targets the private sector with the goal of helping to direct investment decisions. All right, let me see if I can control these slides. There we go. Okay. So that means that ND-Gain, the ND-Global Adaptation Index, is designed to both convey information about vulnerability to climate change and readiness to take adaptation action in the face of climate change, and it's aimed primarily at the private sector. It's freely available, it's open source, and it's led by the University of Notre Dame with collaborations of lots of university researchers. The purpose of that information is to ultimately unlock adaptation solutions in the private sector and other sectors to improve livelihoods and to strengthen market position. So the information is provided so that we can get some action. All right. Here's the philosophy behind ND-Gain, and what a lot of ND-Gain is the index. The Notre Dame Global Adaptation Index is what the acronym stands for. The index measures what matters, we say. It's a tool, again, to prioritize adaptation investment, but that index is a vehicle through which to pursue a larger program of research and innovation, where we define through the index and in other ways, we're defining what adaptation is. We're specifying what kinds of methods may speak to these vulnerabilities and readiness components. We're designing and testing adaptation strategies that reduce those vulnerabilities and enhance that readiness. And then we use ND-Gain as a method to reach out and educate about the issue of adaptation, about the urgency with which we need to help countries become better adapted to climate change. And we use the index as a method of stakeholder engagement, and it's a way for us to be in service of this broad and important issue. So ND-Gain is a country-level index. So there is a score and a ranking for every country around the world, well, for every country for which there are comparable data. This slide shows one of the main ways that we communicate ND-Gain. Each country gets an overall score, but we often sort of decompose that score into two dimensions, to which I've already alluded: vulnerability, which is how responsive or reactive to climate risk a country is, and readiness to take in investment and do something to affect that vulnerability. And so in this two-dimensional space, you can see each individual country and its position. I'll come back to this color coding scheme and this 2D matrix in a moment. The data are in a time series. We have time series data back to 1995, so this allows us to see how countries have changed over time and look at different trends and positioning of different countries. And then you can go in and drill down and examine the different components of ND gain to look at trends over time and certain sectors, compare countries, and so on and so forth. And we're actually working on improving this capacity online at the right now in the coming months. But we already you can already go and explore ND gain online and see the data for individual countries. So country level ranking for 176 countries across 9 variables or sectors. These are different dimensions of the economy or the way that countries are organized that are important to human livelihoods. Those sectors have indicators within them that tell us something about vulnerability and readiness in those indicators. And as I already suggested, 16 years of time series data. So that's a whole lot of data. When you add it all together, we have about 500,000 data points in our database that constitutes ND gain. So the criteria of how data get into ND gain, it has to have global coverage because we want to be able to make direct comparisons between countries. The data need to be transparent and open, which means they tend to come from they come from publicly available sources, reputable sources, things like the World Bank, for example, time series. They need to be freely accessible. The reputable sources mean that there's some quality associated with them, or at least we have a sense of that quality. That quality might vary by country. They need to be comprehensive to the whole country because of the country level index. And we really look for indicators that are actionable, things that a country could decide to do something about. So a country can approach this, or a company investing within a country can approach the index in a strategic kind of way to try to affect change. Here's this matrix again, the 2 dimensions of vulnerability and readiness. Here in this slide, I'm intending to point out the 4 different quadrants. So countries are divided, half the countries fall, we divide it in half along the readiness and the vulnerability scales. So the countries are divided into these 4 pieces. It's good to be green. You're very ready, and you have relatively low vulnerability to climate change. It's less good. In fact, the worst situation to be in is to be red, where you have high vulnerability and not a lot of indicators suggesting you're really ready to take an investment to reduce that vulnerability. So those are where challenges exist about adaptation, but yet there's quite a lot of work to be done. Green countries have high vulnerability, but they may have some infrastructure or governance or social capacity to do something about that. And yellow countries may have low vulnerability, but they also, and that may be having to do with their geographic situation or the structure of their economy. But they have, even those vulnerability may present some challenges because their readiness is not particularly high relative to other countries. So I want to show you here a little video. Because we have time series data, you can watch individual countries move around in this matrix. So before I click go here, you'll see that there are a number of colored dots here. Each dot is a country, but we're highlighting a few of them by coloring them the color of the quadrant. So there are 3 countries here in red. Let's see, those countries are India, China, and Kenya. There's 2 countries in yellow. Those are Brazil and Russia, and a country in green, the United States. And if I make this slide go, you should, oh no, go back. Let's see here. Here we go. You'll see these dots begin to move. There we go. You're going to actually watch a red dot cross into the yellow zone, and you'll watch a yellow dot cross into the green zone. I believe that's China moving into the yellow quadrant and Brazil moving into the green. These are the kinds of analyses or thinking that you can do about how the vulnerability and readiness of countries is changing thanks to the ND gain. Now let me tell you a little bit about the composition of the variables or the indicators that are within the index. On the vulnerability side, this is kind of a busy slide. I'm not looking for anyone to read it very rapidly, but it's an example. Vulnerability is composed of exposure and sensitivity, which constitute a kind of risk to climate change. How exposed are you to climate change and how sensitive are you to that climate change, as well as some good things, adaptive capacity. How prepared are you to deal with shocks in that climate change and deal with climate extremes or changing climatic conditions? And we look at vulnerability in different sectors. Those sectors we think of as being life-supporting. They're important to people's livelihoods. So there are 3 shown here: water, health, and infrastructure. We also have food and ecosystems. And then in each of these components, for each sector in exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity, there's an indicator. So there's a variable in there that is available for all countries, that is actionable, the qualities I discussed previously, that we think is a measure of that thing. And then we add them up across all of the different indicators and come up with a vulnerability component score. And that's what you saw graphed on the previous one axis of the matrix. On the readiness side, things are divided into 3 parts: economic indicators of readiness, governance indicators of readiness, and social indicators of readiness. Again, readiness is about the ability to take in investment to either enhance adaptive capacity or reduce sensitivity, essentially affect your vulnerability. And these are the kinds of ingredients having to do with forming businesses and being accountable to the people, for example, and how educated your population may be. All right. Now let me give you a few country insights here. If you go to the ND-Global site and click on an individual country, you'll get a country profile. So here's India, for example. You can see those indicators constituting vulnerability and readiness across the different sectors. This is just a screenshot, so you would otherwise scroll down to see still more information. You can see time series analysis. You can see that India sits in the red quadrant, kind of on the edge of the red quadrant, and it has an ND score of 123. I have another couple examples here. China. China is slightly more vulnerable, about similar in readiness to India. It has a rank of 105. Again, you can begin to decompose that information to at the level of different indicators. And here's the United States. It's in the green sector, but actually it has, in some respects, a relatively lower ND-Global ranking. It's actually, the United States suffers a little bit relative to what its GDP would otherwise suggest about how prepared it is to deal with climate change, which I think is an important storyline for the United States, in fact. Which speaks to my, let's see, I have 2 more slides before I'm going to pass it back to Joyce for her to polish off our presentation. Things we're thinking about for the future of ND-Global, and we're very interested in feedback and consultation from our potential user community, but also from the other researchers in this space. ND-Global, as I suggested right now, is a country-level index. It would be really informative, as many adaptation actions are actually quite local in scale, to downscale to states or provinces or even municipalities within countries. There are certain challenges that come with that, but this is something that we're looking to in the future. Here is a picture of Brazil, for example. Brazil is a very large country. It would be helpful to have downscaled scoring, at least for Brazil, also for the United States and other countries as well. We are working on an enhanced user interface and a system of allowing users to actually run their own scenarios and their custom country comparisons on the ND-Global website. That's something to look for in the coming year. We work all the time on case studies to demonstrate the real-world application of ND-Global, and we're working with individual stakeholders and organizations who've asked for custom information from ND-Global. We're also interested in creating sub-indices. One that we've discussed is food security, which would be a combination of indicators, for example, having to do with water and food production and perhaps ecosystem health. And of course, we're constantly innovating the index in terms of what new information is available, how does our conceptualization and understanding of adaptation change, and we want the index to be responsive to that over time. And similarly, also associated with ND-Global coming to the University of Notre Dame, we plan to reveal a number or to release a number of innovations in the 2014 release of ND-Gain. But ND-Gain has been our window into thinking about this adaptation issue. There are a number of challenges, but also I think really interesting opportunities suggested by ND-Gain, but apply to many of us in the adaptation space, and I think are appropriate when thinking about the private sector. One is that the adaptation community, if you will, both the research community and the application community, probably isn't accustomed to talking in the same language that business leaders are, and vice versa. We need to be, those of us in the climate change space need to be talking about words and terminology and concepts like risk and supply chain that really actually matter to people in the private sector world. We struggle with ways, and we think we're coming up with new innovations, and ND-Gain already has many compelling innovations about accommodating large data sets and diverse needs of information. But it's always a challenge to think about what are all the different stakeholders and what kinds of information might they consume. Even within the private sector, it's very different to think about, for example, what a consumer products company versus an insurance company might need to know in mitigating risk under climate change. Of course, our ultimate goal through ND-Gain, and I think many of us in the adaptation space, is to get ahead of those risks, to actually prevent damage. We think the way to go about doing that is to anticipate risk, and we do that, again, through raising awareness involving the index and associated research related to the index. We aim to provide meaningful data that help people craft solutions, and we are interested in solution innovations and working with corporations to help implement those solutions. And in all of this, I also think there's an empirical question that needs to be better understood about what is the relationship between those corporate investments and adaptation actions actually happening on the ground. I think ND-Gain has a lot to contribute in thinking about that relationship as well. And with that, I'm going to pass this back to Joyce, where she's going to talk about some examples of where ND-Gain has been used to discover risk and to reveal opportunities in the global marketplace.
Yes, excellent. Thanks so much, Jessica. And I think that's a really helpful segue into this lightning round end here, where we get into some of the details about how some corporations are managing their risks and seeking opportunities in this climate change world. Let's just start with ArcelorMittal, which is a global India and U.S.-owned steel manufacturing corporation that is in the extractives industry. They do not only recycle metal, but also extract new minerals to make new metals. And one of their mergers and acquisitions, they're actually looking at the differences between Liberia and Mali in terms of whether or not they would be better suited to doing certain philanthropic engagements in those countries to shore up the community with new hospitals, roads, or schools as they make those investments. Further, True Value, which many of us know from a very personal perspective in our local neighborhood. Sorry, I seem to have gone way ahead here. Looking to go back a little ways, and it's, yikes. Kate or Whitney, thank you so much. I see you're bringing us back to the presentation. A second example is True Value, our local hardware store, and although they are very much an American company, they have a very specific and international supply chain. And so they're looking at global risk throughout the supply chain according to many different variables, including climate, and ND-Gain is one of the tools they're beginning to conceive of for part of that decision making. Similarly, Skidmore, Owings & Merrill, SOM, builds really incredible buildings all around the world, and as they try to influence their clients about why those buildings need to be more resilient, GAIN helps to illustrate why, particularly in some of the bricks, resiliency is going to be a key driver for remaining ahead of the game in terms of the built environment. And finally, the reinsurance agency Zurich is looking to help inform their consumer base about the importance of resiliency and adaptation. And so GAIN helps them to tell stories to their insured about why it's important to make the right decisions, not only driven by the market of insurance rates, but also driven by information about adaptation that's provided within ND-GAIN to help devolve the next steps. And the last example, I'm sorry, I suppose there's one more, which is a socially responsible investor, Calvert Investments, uses GAIN to help their investors determine where would be the best place for investments that will have a positive impact on saving lives and improving livelihoods while strengthening market positions. My last example, though, has to do with how the non-corporate sector is thinking about where to prioritize adaptation investments. And I think this is a really important point that although today we've been speaking about the private sector, other users of GAIN include the multilateral development banks like the World Bank and the United Nations, as well as bilaterals like in the United States case, the U.S. Agency for International Development, who are trying to figure out where the best place is to put their resources. And especially as I think back to the slides where we were discussing the $100 billion per year commitment for investments, GAIN can really help determine where those funds are most needed and will be best adopted. I'll just end by saying that we are very much hoping to raise the specter of climate adaptation leadership in the corporate sphere, and we'll be giving corporate adaptation awards on an annual basis to adaptation leaders that are having a measurable impact in a least developed country working with a local partner. So stay tuned for more news about that. And we'll close by just saying thank you very much to Kate and to the audience for your interest in ND-GAIN, but especially your interest in climate adaptation in the corporate sphere. We're eager to continue to see innovation and a lot of attention paid to this really crucial next step for all of our futures.
Thank you so much, Joyce and Jessica. We really appreciate your time. And we just have 2 questions for you. Joyce, what are the types of users you're seeing now that are using the GAIN index, and who would you like to reach if you're not currently reaching those particular users?
So that's a great question, and we are really very much in our infancy. The GAIN actually was established in 2010 as a self-standing nonprofit called the Global Adaptation Institute and moved to the University of Notre Dame in April of this year. We have had very short time in the era of ND-GAIN to increase our user base. And so right now the current user is generally the development community, so Catholic Relief Services, for instance. The World Bank might use this tool internally, the bilateral development agencies, as well as global corporations, especially the Fortune 500 or so that see both reputational risk and market opportunity in the climate change world, especially those corporations that have already been leaders in climate mitigation are considering whether this is the next opportunity to earn the license to lead as climate adaptation actors. In the future, I would say that a lot of where GAIN hopes to go is towards those existing partnerships that corporations already rely on for their best-in-class thinking. For instance, the Carbon Disclosure Project, C40, the World Economic Forum, all of these institutions have been thinking very carefully about adaptation, and we're collaborating with some of them to figure out how to put adaptation at the forefront of their agendas in the future.
Yeah, I would.
Great.
Can I add to that? Is that okay? Just briefly?
Sure.
This is Jessica
Sure.
here. You know, we talk about the private sector sometimes like it's this monolithic thing. There are a number of reasons the private sector, as I'm learning myself, could be interested in these kinds of things, and these are the users that we're interested in attracting and are already attracting, as Joyce suggested in our presentation. But one is business opportunities, thinking about risk and your sort of regular operations, if you will, where corporations garner profits and whatnot. Another is that there's a charitable side often to a lot of corporations and to non-governmental organizations, and ND-GAIN can be very important, play an important role in directing where there's the greatest need, in addition to where there might be opportunity, economic opportunity. So I would just speak to that, and then Joyce had already mentioned ND-GAIN could be a useful and is already proving to be a useful tool also in accounting for the effect a company might have which might help it in its corporate responsibility goals.
Oh, that makes a lot of sense. That's great. And Jessica, have you considered adding another element to the index to reflect what countries have done with respect to climate action or adaptation action specifically? Not just how ready they are, but what they're doing?
Yes, that's a wonderful question. We alluded to a number of things that are sort of in the works for ND-Gain. I mean, we have inherited a really amazing tool here with a lot of work and innovation that has gone into this product already. But we're also quite keen to improve upon it, and partially associated, I mean, this will be a continual process, but partially associated with it coming to Notre Dame. We're working on specific innovations that we want to reveal, sort of roll out for 2014. And one of them is thinking about a way to introduce in this component I mean, part of readiness could be countries' ability, to take action, to demonstrate ability to plan or to do projects. And there are a number of possible indicators that could be used to this effect. So we're looking into that thing right at the moment, among several other adjustments and improvements.
That's great. It really sounds like ND-Gain and the index is a great existing tool, but it sounds like it's going to have a lot of utility and opportunity for expansion and growth as time goes on. Is there anything else, either Joyce or Jessica, that you would like to add?
This is Joyce. I'd just like to say that I feel like CAKE plays a really important role in all the outcomes that ND-Gain is looking for, and so we're really grateful for the leadership that you've taken, the network that you've built, the information that you share, and especially the outreach that you do to help further these conversations. Fantastic.
Absolutely. And also we're talking about indices like ND-Gain, and we reference a number of other important resources like CAKE, but all of those resources are constantly defining what adaptation even means, right? We are struggling through this together, and there's always innovation in concepts and measurement, and we're very eager to be, we are excited to be part of that community and constantly figuring out what the best approaches are and what will cause the most good and enable the greatest capacity from all kinds of people, including, in our case, the private sector.
Great. We agree. So that's great. Well, I would like to thank Joyce Coffey and Dr. Jessica Hellman for joining us today. And I'd like to encourage you all to check out the index. The direct link is index.gain.org. And please visit the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange at cakex.org when you have an opportunity. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Pleasure.